Good evening and what's up, everybody? Welcome, Rocket fans and Rocket family, to another edition of Let's Talk Houston Rockets. I'm, of course, KG Kris Gardner of the Houston Roundball Review. And joining me is someone I've known since his University of Houston days, and he was at the Daily Cougar, Mr. Jackson Gatlin. Now he's Mr. Locked On Rockets, Locked On NBA, Locked On whatever else he wants to do with his basketball insight. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing fantastic, Chris. KG, I'm so happy to be here. So happy to be able to talk a little Houston Rockets with you. Yeah, I guess we've known each other for a very long time now. We go way back, man, to the Cougars days. I've been slacking. I need to pick up my Cougars coverage a little bit. I've kind of dropped the ball in that regard. So much of my time just consumed covering these Rockets. But the Cougars deserve it, man. Hey, look, I mean, they've been the best basketball team in Houston the last couple of years. So maybe they deserve a little bit more coverage from my perspective, at least.
Hey, if you got the time, man, I don't know how you're going to fit it all in with everything you're doing. So I don't know. But go on. How are you doing? Yo, go on. It's been a minute, man. How are you doing? Thank you for chiming in. And this will be a fun, roughly hour. Got Rocket fans who are chiming in, maybe shocked that Jackson is joining me here on the show. You've been requested, man. You have been requested a few times to be on the show, and we're making it happen. Thank you for taking time to do this. This young man is very busy, so I had to fit him into. He had to fit, be made into my schedule, his schedule, to be on the show. So I kind of gave him almost a week notice. So thanks very much, man, for doing this. Solo D-Lo, how are you doing? A lot of these folks you already know. They know you, Jackson, from your time on Locked On Rockets. So this won't be any news to them. I'd be kind of surprised if there's anybody who chimes in tonight who doesn't know who Jackson is, who's a Rockets fan. So Slim Boss, how you doing? Let's get right into it. I have not, and don't shoot the messenger. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on this, but where do you stand if you were the GM of the Rockets? Who would be your top choice to be the head coach of the Rockets?
Right now, as it currently stands, all the cards on the table, Chris, I'm currently leaning Ime Udoka as my top candidate. I have my reservations and my concerns for sure about Ime as a candidate. And I've also got concerns that with the recent news that the Toronto Raptors moving on from Nick Nurse, it very much feels like they have their eyes set on Ime Udoka right now. And I kind of worry with the other candidates that they've kind of reported as far as their interest in other possible applicants for that Raptors head coaching gig, Jerry Stackhouse and I believe Patrick Mutombo, guys who have had some affiliation with their Raptors 905, the G League team. It's not like they have this long list of potential candidates, whereas the Rockets were like, yeah, we're going out there and we're going after every big name available. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the Raptors are like, we're interested in Ime Udoka and maybe like these other guys. And so it kind of seems like Masai Ujiri being a little laissez-faire about the whole thing. I kind of am worried that the Raptors are going to swoop in and take Ime out from under the Rockets' feet. But he's my top tier candidate. Would you like to go down the list, or you just want my number one guy for now? And I'm sure we're going to discuss
we'll discuss it, but yeah. Ironically, on last Saturday's show, and I haven't changed, but your point is very good and right on. I said Ime as well.
Okay, there we go.
So we're consistent on that. And I think, except for Solo here, a lot of fans agreed with us, but now Nick Nurse, of course, was not available as of last Saturday, and he is now. But your rationale is sound, and Ime is, I think, the top choice for the Raptors. So there is a real chance that he'll land in Toronto rather than Houston, and then we can discuss Nick Nurse as a choice. But let's just go down the list. Let's go down the known candidates, alphabetical order if you want to, with Kenny Atkinson first. Where would he rank on your list?
We're going alphabetical. I like it. Okay. Kenny's actually kind of at the bottom of my list, honestly.
Okay.
Chris. I'm not sure where you have him ranked, but it's weird because I kind of came out of the gate and he was actually near the top of my list originally. But the more that I've sat here and kind of thought about it and thought about what this Rockets team desperately needs a lot of, I really feel like kind of changing things up a little bit, bringing in a guy with a bit more of a defensive identity, somebody who's going to really, not that Kenny Atkinson wouldn't necessarily hold these young kids accountable and get them to really fight hard and go out there and, put the best foot forward, all those different things. I just think Kenny is more of an offensive minded coach. And to me, I think it's a lot harder for, I've said this a few times in various places, but I think it's a lot harder for a good offensive coach to get even like a mediocre defense out of his players than it is for a good defensive coach who has a top tier defense to get, say, mediocre offense out of his guys. Because so much about offense in the NBA today is just predicated on talent, right? Like you're more talented than the other team. And that's, it's based on, do you have the star power? Do you have the talent? All of that. There's only so many different ways that you can skin a cat, right? The X's and O's of offense, you can only draw up so many different plays. You can only figure out how to do dribble handoffs a certain way or running guys off pin downs a certain way. At the end of the day, it's a make or miss league. You're either going to have the talent or you don't. But defense is so much more about the identity, the culture, the effort, the buy-in, top to bottom, from your coach to your players to, all the guys 1 through 15 on the roster, and getting everybody committed towards that same common goal of being a good defensive team. And I feel like the defensive coaches that are available to the Rockets this go around, so Udoka, Vogel, Nick Nurse, those are all guys who have a track record of getting their teams to buy in defensively. And I think that would be a really nice change of pace for this Rocket squad.
James Borrego.
I don't like Borrego necessarily as a head coaching option. I think he did well in his stint in Charlotte, given what he had to work with. He actually ever so slightly, very thin, slightly, like lowercase, like 9-point font, slightly exceeded expectations every season that he was in Charlotte by like 1 or 2 wins each season. He managed to drag that team to the play-in a few times. But at the same time, I just don't know if he would be like the right guy to kind of go to. I think the Rockets desperately need a change, right? They took the unproven route with Steven Silas back in 2020, right? They saw a young, unproven assistant, somebody with some potentially very high upside, somebody who would maybe mesh well and kind of follow in the footsteps of Mike D'Antoni and maybe be able to convince James Harden, hey, stick around in Houston. We got a good thing going here. And it kind of blew up spectacularly. Yes. And it's unfortunate for Steven, and I wish him all the best moving forward, but they need the inverse of that now, right? I think it's very clear that they tried the unproven commodity, and now they want to bring in somebody with a proven track record, somebody that can, has been there, has done that, has had a modicum of success at the NBA level. And I think so far that's pretty consistent with all the candidates that have been heavily rumored or at least interviewed so far to this point as for this position. And I don't necessarily think Borrego fits the bill, right? He's been a head coach, didn't have a whole ton of success. I'd be incredibly excited about him as a lead assistant for either an Udoka or a Nick Nurse type possibly. And there's even a track record with him and Ime Udoka having spent time together on the San Antonio Spurs bench. They actually met first when Ime was still a player for the Spurs before he retired. Then, Borrego went his separate ways, spent some time with a couple different organizations, made his way back to the Spurs. And so they're both from that Greg Popovich coaching tree. And I could maybe see a world where if the Rockets do somehow walk away with Udoka as their next head coach, that Borrego, given their past alignment and time spent together, maybe that relationship is strong enough where he would be willing to, after having taken this past season off, not being a part of any coaching staff anywhere, rather than trying to jump back in the saddle as a head coach for a team like, say, the Detroit Pistons, maybe he could, jump in as an associate coach or lead assistant for somebody that he has a really strong relationship with in Ime Udoka.
Jamon has brought up the guy we're going alphabetical, and I'm kind of, based on your answer regarding Borrego, do you feel the same about Sam Cassell and Adrian Griffin?
I do feel the same about Adrian Griffin, and I have a little wrinkle to the Adrian Griffin one. I actually don't feel the same about Sam Cassell.
Okay,
I would have Cassell on my list at 5th because to me, even though he would technically be a rookie head coach, his first stint coaching a team, I don't think Sam Cassell is like necessarily as kind of green around the gills as like Steven Silas was, or one of these other potential long-term assistants who hasn't had necessarily head coaching experience before, because it's Sam Cassell, man. Like, he's been there, he's done that. He's had championship experience both as a player, as a coach. He's been around the league he carries a certain pedigree, cachet to his name. And I think that kind of in and of itself carries enough weight where it's not like a Steven Silas who's stepping into this role for the very first time, maybe a little bit overwhelmed in the beginning of like what all it kind of entailed being a head coach of a team the accountability aspect of it. I don't think Sam would struggle with any of that. All the little things, the kind of the intangibles of being a head coach, I think Sam would actually excel at. So I have like, the Rockets kind of like tier 1 list of candidates, right? With the Udokas, the Atkinsons, Vogel, and Nick Nurse kind of up there in one tier. And then I'd put Sam Cassell right at the forefront of like that tier 2 list for me.
All right, Nick Nurse.
I think he's very safely got to be your second best option at this point, and that's kind of just personal preference, because I could very easily
let me ask you. Let me ask you, because we believe Ime Udoka. Well, he's our top choice.
Mm-hmm.
But where do you think Tillman is leaning if he had a choice between Udoka and Nick Nurse?
I feel like something about the way Ime's person, like they're both pretty fiery coaches, right? The way that they coach on the sidelines is pretty fiery. I know that there was some frustration internally about some of the lack of demonstrative behavior, for lack of better terminology, from Steven at times on the sidelines, right? Just kind of the complacent, like, get after it, guys, that kind of thing. And really not, tearing into guys and really, just kind of giving them a full-blown dressing down and all that. And, Ime is easily, and Nick Nurse too, they're the kind of guy, they'll grab you by the collar and tell you, hey, you messed this up, or they're going to grab you and bench you and, tear into you for that kind of stuff. So I actually don't know if there would necessarily be a full-blown preference between the two, because I think they both kind of answer a lot of the similar questions. It's more just how is their approach a little bit different, maybe schematically on the defensive side, offensively, maybe slightly different philosophy. I think Ime has maybe a slight edge because, again, he's got that former player, that connection with his guys that Nick Nurse doesn't necessarily have. So I don't know if they, from Tillman's perspective, I don't know about a preference of opinion there, but I think that at least for me, when you're looking at it, there is a very solid argument for either of those guys to be the best candidate for the Rockets. We're both in the Ime camp currently, but you could very easily make a very compelling argument for Nick Nurse, and I wouldn't be upset with that at all. I think both guys have a pretty solid track record. I think there's there's concerns on both sides at the end of the day, because Nick Nurse, there's concerns about why things kind of started to tailspin the way that they did in Toronto these last few years after a lot of success right out of the gate. And then with Ime, there's the concern of, okay, he only did it for one season. Right. So was it flash in the pan success, or is he actually really capable? And he only got the one season, opportunity because of the off the court issues that he was dealing with. So it's kind of a toss up between the warts on both sides, I guess.
And I'm not even, I'll bring it up because the point for me about Ime is he did it in 1 year. That's my concern. I don't know how Tillman's thinking. Tillman may weigh the indiscretion in Boston bigger than the 1 year flash in the pan kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But Tillman wants, where's the comment? I think Tillman leans more toward wanting the big hire. Here we go, from H-Town's finest, right here. Want to say he has a championship head coach. Would you agree with that mindset from Tillman's perspective? And if so, then that is Nurse or Vogel.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great point from H-Town's finest, right? From a PR perspective, being able to walk out there after 3 seasons of an abundant amount of losing, to be able to turn things around and say, yes, we have a championship caliber head coach that we're bringing in, from a marketing perspective, from a PR perspective, all that would be a dream for Tillman to be able to turn around and say that and have a guy that matches that, right? Where not only, like, obviously you have the championship on the resume, but then somebody who actually kind of fits the bill and addresses many of those concerns. I think in that regard, then yeah, Nick Nurse probably does kind of edge out Ime Udoka as far as organizationally how they're looking at things.
And Nick Nurse, when he coached in the G League, the Vipers, he had young talent. Oh, that's the G League's young talent. He had no problem playing them and with rotations. And so what changed? Because in the end in Toronto, he did only play like 7-8 guys, and the Raptors players averaged the most minutes, per game in the league. So which seemed counter to what the front office wanted. So what changed there, do you think?
At least my understanding from the handful of like kind of Raptors centric, beat reporters, coverage guys that I've like spoken to about this is part of it had to do with Nick Nurse kind of was frustrated by the lack of talent on the roster and some of the moves or lack thereof made by Masai. And in a way, sort of almost passive aggressively was leaning very heavily on the top end talent that they had on that Raptors roster. And in a way, it's weird because I feel like this narrative started to kind of creep up where it's like, oh, well, Nick Nurse doesn't like young players and he doesn't play the young guys and he doesn't give them a chance or minutes to develop. And it's, well, no, it's just like the young guys on that Raptors team are just not very good, unfortunately. When you look at, first off, they drafted Scotty Barnes. They made him a focal point of what they were trying to do. One of the most impressive things that Nick Nurse was able to do with Scotty Barnes was put the ball in his hands quite a bit more than I think anybody expected his rookie year, and kind of made him a focal point of the offense to then minimize one of Scotty's only true shortcomings on the floor, which is he's not a good shooter. So how do you minimize that? You put the ball in his hands and you let him be the decision maker on the floor for the other guys. Very Draymond Green-esque, if you will, right? So not only did he do that, but then you look at guys like Pascal Siakam, Fred VanVleet, OG Anunoby, guys who have far exceeded probably any level of expectations of what they could ultimately be as NBA players. And Nick Nurse played a huge role in all of their development. So when you look at this season, especially for the Raptors, where across the board, like players regressed, guys weren't shooting the ball as well, efficiency numbers were down. Fred VanVleet had one of the worst years of his career shooting the three ball in a contract year, no less, for some reason. And they still flirted with being a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense. I think you have to give a lot of credit to Nick Nurse for all of that.
See, again, we're going to find disagreement at some point. Right now, we're on the same page, and trust me, that'll change at some point.
You know what? Never mind, Chris. Nick Nurse is a terrible coach, and he would be awful if he took over the. No, well, I'm sure we're going to stumble upon a disagreement at some point, or it just means that we're two very smart individuals who know ball.
Well, I like that. I like that answer. It's that Cougar connection as well. Basketball,
absolutely,
with the UH mindset also goes there. Let's see. Frank Vogel, your thoughts on Frank Vogel?
Vogel is the super duper safe pick. He's not super exciting. And maybe there shouldn't be there shouldn't be as much maybe negativity around the idea of Frank Vogel possibly being the next head coach. And maybe push back on this if I'm wrong here, Chris. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I feel like Rockets fans are maybe a little disappointed or even frustrated at the thought of Frank Vogel being the next head coach. And I don't necessarily share those sympathies. While I wouldn't necessarily be as excited about Vogel as I would an Udoka or a Nurse, because I very much feel like the upside is quite a bit higher on those guys.
Yeah.
Hell, even the upside might even be higher on a Kenny Atkinson, who's a bit more of an unproven commodity at this point. But Vogel is the safe pick, right? And he is a substantial upgrade from where you were at with Steven Silas. He's a championship level head coach, like the chat has pointed out already. And the big thing for me with Vogel is he's done it multiple ways, right? So he had a lot of success with a very young Indiana Pacers team. He had Paul George for the first 5 years of his career, and they just kind of ran into the behemoth that was the Miami Heatles back in the day, right? And then, he had the little blip on his, pit stop in Orlando, and that's, we'll toss that to the side. And then he had LA, where he really wasn't given necessarily the best of circumstances in LA, right? Like coaching LeBron it's like a double-edged sword, right? Yeah, you're getting to coach LeBron, but like you're coaching LeBron, and like you get all the drama, all the complexities that come with that. Not only that, then he also had to reintroduce Russell Westbrook to that locker room. He had to deal with the massaging of all those egos, and it was a lot, and he still managed to turn it into a title. So I think that not Nick Nurse, I apologize, Frank Vogel should get a lot of credit for those separate tenures and the level at which he coached. It's just at the end of the day, he's also a very, I think, unimaginative coach on the offensive end, and almost to the point where it's like, just roll the ball out there and let the talent kind of win out offensively. And that's where if you could get a guy like a James Borrego to step in as like a lead assistant and kind of give them the conductor role offensively, or even potentially just holding on to a holdover from the previous regime and promoting maybe Mahmoud Abdel-Fattah to the new lead assistant and letting him run the offense, guys who have a bit more creativity on that end, or a bit more proclivity for successful offenses, and let him focus on the head coaching role and like the defensive side of the ball. So I don't know. Do you share those sentiments on Vogel?
Without a doubt, he's a safe pick. I do wonder. I mean, it wouldn't be a first if he would keep Mahmoud on his staff. If any of whoever's hired as the next head coach would keep Mahmoud on their staff, because he's so highly thought of, with his offensive mind. So I'm kind of curious about that. Most likely no, but it's not impossible that the next head coach won't keep him and have him in the offense coordinator kind of role for the staff.
I
But
would just I would hate to see Mahmoud go somewhere else, right, and have
yeah,
success. Where it's and at the same time, I don't. It's not like we want the Rockets to like, you know, tie him to a desk in Toyota Center and say you can't leave. Like if he has an opportunity for a better role elsewhere, then yes, you want to let him spread his wings and fly. But he just strikes me as such a good basketball mind, right? He really rose through the ranks at the G League level, had success down there, got a shot with the team, and it would just be a very disappointing thing to see him leave Houston and go have that success elsewhere. Maybe like a la kind of a like a Chris Finch type, or again maybe a Nick Nurse type, right? Somebody who did their time with the Raptors and then didn't necessarily get a shot at the NBA level with the Rockets. So then they go to another organization. You're like, man, we had this guy like homegrown product and we kind of let him slip. So
yep. All right. People are asking me this, so I'm going to ask you, put it out there. What are your thoughts on Rafael Stone and the job he's done so far?
Oh my.
shout out to Eric Gordon making an appearance here, talking Rockets with us. I think that it's been kind of a mixed bag with Rafael so far. And I think that's like the most honest and fair assessment is there have been some moments where you think, okay, he handled XYZ about as well as he probably could have. And then there's been some moments that are kind of head scratchers. I think the best way for me to kind of, because it's a 3-year window, right? So like how do you summarize a 3-year window? I think mixed bag is probably the best takeaway. And when you can, because I certainly have done my fair share of, shared my frustrations with maybe some of the day-to-day, like the micro, the little stuff, right? The little stuff has been very frustrating, right? The development on an individual game-by-game basis of the players, moves at the margins, things of that nature. It's almost felt like the organization for a while was operating retroactively rather than proactively, right? When it comes to certain moves that were being made, like it felt like they took way too long to deal Christian Wood, felt like they took way too long to trade Eric Gordon. And those are things that the front office should be criticized for. But then
John Wall.
Oh, the John Wall situation. Yeah, with the John Wall situation, just the entire Kevin Porter Jr. experiment, which I was signed up for it. I was like, okay, bench John Wall, give Kevin Porter Jr. the reins. Awesome. Let's do it. Let's go all in with it. A year should have been enough. A year should have been enough of a sample size to be like, you know what? Maybe this isn't the best choice moving forward. Maybe we should actually go, right, like get like a legitimate point guard on the roster. And then they were like, no, we're going to run it back for a second year. And it was kind of like, okay, what are we doing here? We kind of saw that it wasn't super great last year. It's going to get like noticeably better this next year. And I really don't think it did, unfortunately. So now that's 2 years down the drain when really you could have just done that experiment for 1 year. So, but to end on a bit more of a positive note here is I think organizationally they did set out and accomplish what they wanted to, right? They were very transparent with us from the get-go. They were going to be bad for 3 years. They were going to be bad. They were going to accrue a lot of top talent. And that's exactly what they've done, right? They've reset their books. This is probably the most finely tuned reset that I can remember personally in NBA in recent memory in the last like couple decades, where a team has cleared their cap space, acquired a ton of young talent, is able to start a fresh chapter with a brand new head coach and a new direction for the franchise all in one offseason, right? It's very rare that you get all these things to line up exactly the way that they did. And so they accomplished that. I think that it's kind of still the jury's out a little bit. No legal pun intended with Rafael being a lawyer, but the jury's still out a little bit. And this offseason is going to tell us a lot about the next steps and direction for this organization. So much so to the point where you can even just look at the coaching hire, right? They need somebody to give this organization a shot in the arm of like credibility, right? They need somebody, a name hire that is going to, at least around the league, and the perception will change overnight depending on who this Rockets team hires as their next head coach. So if they go out there and they get a name like an Udoka or a Nurse, then you're like, okay, yeah, they're back on track. They're going the right direction. But if they go out there and they hire a Borrego or an Adrian Griffin or, a Scotty Brooks, like, somebody lower on the totem pole, then you can be like, okay, well, is ownership really, really willing to shell out for a top tier coach? Are they actually trying to move in a different direction? Is Rafael Stone looking for somebody that he can kind of maintain some level of influence over, like he did, to an extent with Steven Silas? Like all these questions are suddenly going to start creeping up. Whereas all those questions can be laid to rest the moment you hire the next right guy.
And leaning into one of my questions for you, if because we know, and Kelly Eco put it out there for everyone who didn't know about Rafael at some points, kind of having an influence over the roster, over Steven Silas. Do you think a top tier head coach like a Nick Nurse, someone who's won a championship, someone who has a lot of cachet, would take the job here and still give Rafael, okay, Rafael, I'm okay with you and your influence to a point, but I'm in charge. So if you do with Steven isn't going to fly with me.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big question, right? And I think common logic would tell you no, right? Like somebody who's had the level of success that any of these guys have had, that we're talking about as some of the top tier options for the Rockets, they wouldn't. There's a level of, right, you can influence things and you can have a dialogue and you can have discussions and you can have input, but there's a difference between, like, say, an input and maybe a mandate, right? I think we can very safely look at Kevin Porter Jr. as like a mandate, right? Like the Kevin Porter Jr. experiment was something that was conjured by Stone and the Rockets front office, right? It's something that they went all in on, for better or for worse. And there are a lot of things that they have kind of committed, maybe some sunk costs here and there, like the whole benching John Wall for an entire season, right? The front office had to sell Tillman on the idea of, hey, this guy is making $40+ million, but we don't want him to play a second of basketball. And here's why.
Yeah.
We have this really exciting young guy that we think can be like an all-star caliber talent. And they had to sell ownership and Tillman on the idea of benching John Wall, right? And now maybe if John Wall had decided to actually, play ball a little bit and be willing to come off the bench, then he would have still been able to play, 10, 15, 20 minutes a night, whatever, and could have still been a contributing member of the team in some capacity. But very clearly they wanted to give the reins and the starting job to Kevin. And that's one of those costs. One of the other costs associated with that entire idea is maybe some of the delayed development of some of the other young players on the roster, right? Not having a legitimate, I won't even say seasoned guard, just somebody who's been playing the point guard position for their entire career, somebody who understands the innate responsibilities of that role, would have easily been able to facilitate a little bit better for guys like Jalen, like Sengun, like this year, like Jabari, right? Where we saw the moments when DJ Augustine or Dennis Schroeder were on the floor and things kind of suddenly looked different. It was like, oh, like this is what an actual point guard looks like at the NBA level, because they're not still figuring it out, right? And that's not necessarily a slight to Kevin. It's arguably the hardest position to figure out at an NBA level, right? You're quarterbacking the entire offense. And while I think he's had some magnificent highs, he's also had some lows and he's had some bumps in the road along the way. So, it's really tough to think about what the next person is going to do when they step in here. But I do think that where it does come from is, and this is the one narrative that I would push back on, is like, I don't think any of this was done like maliciously. Like, to my knowledge, the relationship between Rafael and Steven is incredible. Those two guys really worked well together and they appreciated each other. They were both just very brand new at this thing, right? Rafael, a rookie GM, Steven, a rookie head coach. And what is your inclination if you were to put yourself in Rafael's shoes, Kris, and you see a rookie head coach, or you're a rookie head coach, you're the first head coach you've ever hired at the NBA level, and he's floundering or he's struggling or he's dealing with tough decisions and he's really, freezing up a little bit. Is your inclination going to be hands off, I'll let him deal with it? Or is it going to be, oh, I'm going to step in there and try to help him out, right? I'm going to offer suggestions or advice, or I'm going to. So did he go about it the wrong way? Probably, right? Like, because you don't want to.
That's what I think he did. I don't.
Yeah.
He shouldn't have done it at practice.
Yeah.
Talk to Steven behind closed doors, because that got out. For Kelly to write about it, Kelly's a great person, great at his job. But for someone to see that and then put it out there, that's the bad look about it.
Yeah. Because you don't want to undermine the authority of your head coach is the problem. And I think that's where the boundaries were overstepped to a point where the moment you undermine Steven's authority, then what are the, suddenly how do the other assistant coaches view that? How do the players view that? How do the staff and personnel view that? And it kind of it's like a stack of cards and it all just comes tumbling down from that point. So no, the very long-winded way of getting to that answer, right, is I do not think that an established coach with pedigree like a Nurse or an Udoka or a Vogel would allow that to happen, and it just wouldn't even be a concern at that point, because I feel like Rafael, with a coach like that in tow, wouldn't necessarily feel the need to then step in, right? Because it's like, okay, this coach knows what he's doing, right? He's been there, done that. I've got full faith and trust in him to accomplish the goals that we have set out.
Do you think John Lucas will be back.
I think he's actually in the same kind of boat as Mahmoud, where of the names on the Rockets assistant coaching list, I feel like those are the two most likely candidates to potentially return to be like holdovers from the previous era. And I'm torn on this, Kris, so I'd actually love your opinion on this. I can't figure out if it would be better to just have a full-blown clean slate reset and bring back nobody, or if having some holdovers, right, guys, so Lucas, Mahmoud, possibly both of them, maybe one of them, whatever, to have a guy or both guys possibly on the bench for whoever the new head coach is, to have a connection with these players from the previous era, right? A guy who's been there and kind of been alongside Jalen for a couple of years, been alongside KJ, Alp, Jabari, and knows some of the trials and tribulations that they went through, rather than this like brand new, guy who's coming in. He's like, he has no prior experience with these kids. I can't decide which one would actually be better. And I'm sure both sides have merit. So I'm really unsure which direction would be more beneficial for the organization moving forward. What do you think about it?
I think it's better to clean house.
Okay.
New staff, and it may not work. You may have wanted to keep Luke too because of the relationship or being the hard ass sometimes that the players respect him because they know him and know how he is. But I think it just really would be best for everybody involved to just clean house with the staff and going forward. Head coach is in charge. Don't have to worry about anybody saying, "Well, this is how we used to do it." No.
Exactly. That's
So
definitely one of the worries, right? It was like, well, the last year we did this, right? And I will say one caveat here, or maybe not a caveat, but a side note at least, is I think historically, and I got this kind of like, friend of a friend information, but apparently, I guess historically, Frank Vogel's been a coach who likes to have like a former player or two like on his staff, on the sidelines with him as far as his assistant coaches. So that could be an element that plays into, if Vogel is ultimately the head coach hired, then maybe he's more inclined to hold on to a guy like John Lucas, who is so well respected in the NBA community, has been a former player, has all his connections with the guys on the team already. That could play into the idea of him, kind of occupying that role for Frank Vogel. Whereas again, like, a guy like Ime, he is a former player himself, so he doesn't maybe necessarily feel the need to have that level of input or that different set of eyes, different perspective from things on his coaching, on his assistant coaching staff. There we go.
And if you're late joining us on this edition of Let's Talk Houston Rockets, of course, I am KG Kris Gardner, owner of the Houston Roundball Review. And joining me this evening is Jackson Gatlin of Locked On NBA, Locked On Rockets, all those Locked On things. We've known each other since his days as a student at the University of Houston when he worked for the Daily Cougar in the sports department. So that goes back a long ways. So you never know who you know, folks. Just keep that in mind. Don't burn bridges. All right.
It's not even don't burn bridges. It's guys, I would not be where I'm at today without Kris's guidance and help. This man mentored me. He remembers the days when I was sitting in press conference rooms afraid to ask Kelvin Sampson a question because I didn't want to get chewed out. Because I remember my very first press conference, and we were at what is it, TSU?
Yes.
TCU.
Yep.
Okay. So
TSU.
TSU. And this was before Fertitta Center was fully built. And so the Cougars were starting their season. They were playing their home games there. And we get into the first press conference, and Kelvin sits down to do the post game. And I forget which reporter was trying to ask Kelvin a question. And they entered this back and forth where Kelvin got heated with an actual reporter, like an adult big boy full-time journalist job, like not a student reporter. And from that moment on, I was terrified of Kelvin Sampson, of asking him the wrong question and him coming at me sideways. So I got over that fear, thanks in large part to Kris, who helped coach me up and teach me, the right way to approach these situations. So thank you, KG.
My pleasure, man. It's all about, passing the forward, paying it forward. So that is legit, because Coach Sampson will, doesn't matter who you are, at some point he will rip you a new one. So it's all part of the process. Victor Wembanyama, what are your thoughts on him? And if the Rockets won the lottery, clearly they're going to draft him number one if they win the lottery, right? In your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Does that mean the end of Alp as a Rocket?
Absolutely not. If it's almost like, in a way, Jabari is like theoretically almost one of the like a perfect complementary player to Sengun. Now his three ball wasn't quite where it needed to be this last season. Really struggled with that. Started to pick up as the year came to a close. But if you could like construct a player in a laboratory to complement and maybe mask some of the weaknesses that Alpi has as a starting center, Jabari, you'd come pretty close. You'd be like, okay, yeah, like these probably, 85, 90% of what you would want playing at the 4 spot next to Alp if he's your 5. Wemby is like 100% of what you would want playing at the 4 spot next to Alp, right? He's got the length, the size, the shooting, and it in a way it almost serves Wemby too, because if Wembanyama comes in and he's your starting 5 at the NBA level, he's going to get ragdolled around next year, right? Like it's almost really beneficial for like the Thunder and Chet Holmgren that he didn't have to play his rookie year and was able to spend an entire season in an NBA strength and conditioning program and getting his body up. He's going to come in and have a lot more success, I feel like, this next season than he would have had he started this year, because physically, he's going to be in a much better place. So Wemby's going to really struggle adjusting to the physicality of the NBA game right out of the gate. He's going to make up for it with his talent. He's going to make up for it with his size, his length, his athleticism, all that. But there's going to be moments where you look at him like, okay, yeah, this is a 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid. If he's playing at the 4 next to Sengun can always handle the task of like guarding the bigger 5s, right? And you put Wemby more so on the perimeter or as a weak side help defender, weak side rim protection, all of that. And the idea of a front court featuring Jabari Smith Jr. at the 3, Wembanyama at the 4, and Sengun at the 5 should be incredibly exciting to Rockets fans, because that's 2 really lengthy, versatile forwards who can kind of make up some of the ground that you give up a little bit maybe on the defensive side with Alp as your 5.
See, that's my ideal front line for the Rockets. Moving Jabari to the 3, and then you'd have so much flexibility regarding
Absolutely.
opponents, and you could just mix and match with whoever they're playing, and then you'd have a lot of advantages offensively because the Alp's passing skills, and we'll have to see, of course, if Wemby can shoot the NBA 3 consistently.
We still have to see if Jabari can shoot the NBA 3 consistently
because for most of this season, Jabari didn't either.
Yeah.
So that'll be an issue. But I think the 3 of them could make it work. So I'm in that camp. So if the Rockets get Wemby, Alp's time as a Rocket is not over, in my opinion. Jackson agrees with that. James Harden.
Can I add a caveat really quick, though?
Yes, please do.
I do think, though, it makes the idea of trading Alp a lot more palatable, right? Because Alp, I think if you were to look at the Rockets and take like stock inventory of all their assets, Jalen and Alp are probably the 2 most lucrative trade chips that you have if you're the Rockets, or potentially wherever the top pick in this year's draft lands, right? Those are the most lucrative trade chips that you have. And so if you do draft Wemby, then there's a world where if the right trade package comes along, then maybe you are more inclined to want to move on from Alp, because you're like, well, yeah, we could keep Alp and play Wemby at the 4, and and we could make them all coexist, or we can get this shiny new toy by trading Alp, and it's a more well-rounded roster. And in the future, 3-4 years from now, it works out a lot better because we made the move when we did. Those are the tough decisions that I'm not envious of that Rafael Stone has to make, because the idea of trading Sengun, it scares me, because I think he has future all-star potential. I think there's a blueprint for success when you look at what the Sacramento Kings have done this season with Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox. I think the Rockets have all those pieces to put that exact same stew together. It's just going to take the right head coach to get the right stuff out of this group of guys. But there's a blueprint there, and I'm not ready necessarily to abandon it by moving on from Sengun.
Fair. And I'm going to put a pin in the James Harden discussion.
Okay.
Let's keep it with draft. If the Rockets get the 2nd pick, Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller?
Amen Tom. No, I'm kidding. I'll do my best.
Or him. Or yeah.
do my best Max Kellerman impersonation. I want Amen Thompson. No, not the Iguodala quote. No, it definitely Scoot Henderson. I don't know how is Scoot number 2 on your board, Kris? Or are you vacillating between him? Is this going to be where we disagree?
I'm going back and forth. And right now, I think last Saturday I said Brandon Miller, so I'll be consistent for now. But my concern with Brandon is, well, 2 concerns really. His decision making, just flat out decision making.
Okay.
And then his numbers against very good teams in college were not as good as his numbers against average to below average teams in college. So his performance against better competition is a concern for me. But it all depends on what you see as the Rockets. This would be a question that we have. Might as well get into this as well. In your opinion, what is Rockets' biggest need?
They need a point guard. They need somebody
Okay.
they need somebody to run this team. And so I do think if you're the number 2 pick, you have very similar to last year, right? When they landed number 3. I feel like it's pretty rare where both the best player available also is the best fit available for your team. And I very much feel like if the Rockets land number 2, not only is Scoot Henderson the best player available, he is also the best fit and checks all the boxes for what this Rockets team needs desperately, which is somebody to run the show, be the straw that stirs the drink, whatever expression you want to use. So, I mean, you draft Scoot Henderson and that answers a lot of questions immediately. And then you also have a backcourt of Scoot Henderson, Jalen Green could very easily be the best backcourt in the NBA in just a handful of years. And when I look at the argument between Scoot Henderson and Brandon Miller, I think you have to, rather than looking at the players, right, look at their archetypes. And this was actually suggested to me. This argument was posed by Assad, member of Rockets Twitter. Great follow if you're not following him. And he basically made the compelling argument that if you were to compare archetypes, right, Scoot Henderson is like the, high IQ, run the offense, high facilitating, dynamic scoring point guard, right? And then Brandon Miller is like the, very top end, right? Let's say all-star 3-and-D caliber with like some added playmaking, right? He's been comped to a Paul George maybe on his top end. So, but in a vacuum, I mean, let's compare by going via the archetypes. Let's pick some of the guys at the top end of those respective archetypes, right? You could say like a Chris Paul type or like a John Wall type versus a Paul George type. And to me, I think the likelihood of those guys reaching their respective ceilings, I think Brandon Miller is much closer to maybe like a less than all-star 3-and-D role player, maybe like a Mikal Bridges or a Cam Johnson type than he is to being a Paul George. Whereas I'm much more confident in Scoot and reaching his ceiling, just watching him play, right? He gets it. He plays with so much control and poise for such a young player, and that's only going to get better with age. To me, really, the only knock on Scoot Henderson right now is his outside shot.
Yes.
And it's not even a huge concern for me, Kris, because he shoots so well from the free throw line in mid-range, and historically that translates over time, right? It might not translate right away, but it'll translate over time that if you're a good shooter at the free throw line and in the mid-range, you will eventually become at least an adequate 3-point shooter. And that's the only thing missing from his game currently.
And let me give a thanks to, we got a lot of questions, as I know you would, from Rocket fans here on this edition of Let's Talk Houston Rockets with Jackson Gatlin from Locked On Rockets.
Am I not seeing the... Hang on.
H-Town finest there you go. I don't know what you were doing, but yeah, they are.
No. I have. It's the peek behind the curtain. I didn't see the comments loaded on the right side. This is cool. Okay, now I can keep up with the chat. What's up, guys? All right.
But yeah, H-Town's finest. Thank you for the tip donation to the show, and this is for both of us. We kind of touched on it a little bit, but what coaching candidate do we think would be the best option for the Rockets' young core?
You want to go first, Kris?
You go first. You're the guest.
Sure. Well, it's your show, man. I'm trying
You're
to make
guest.
sure
You're the guest.
I'm not stepping on your toes, man.
No. You're the guest.
I think it's tough because right now, even though the messaging, right, is okay, we have ended phase 1 of the rebuild. We're moving into phase 2. Phase 2 does not mean instant competitiveness, right? There's still a level. There's a ladder that still has to be climbed for this core. But at the same time, I think whoever they bring in as their next head coach has to be able to fill both roles, right? You want a coach who's going to be able to compete at the highest level, ideally, and be able to coach playoff caliber. Like, you can't just hire a developmental guy. If you could get away with just hiring a developmental guy, I might say Kenny Atkinson is your best bet to develop the rest of this Rockets young core. I think he's done a phenomenal job in all of his different stops. I think he got a lot out of his stint with the Brooklyn Nets. I mean, he made D'Angelo Russell an all-star. Like, that's impressive.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot to be said for Kenny Atkinson as a developmental guy. But I think the candidate who encompasses both roles best, right, being a top-end coach and has the track record for development, I think it's got to be Nick Nurse, hands down.
Okay, yep. And one of my issues, I guess, I don't know if it's an issue, but I'm not sure. I'm not, I guess, convinced if Kenny Atkinson will leave the Warriors. I mean, he did it once before. He said, had a chance to go to Charlotte and decided to stay with Golden State because of how well run that franchise is. And if he has any concerns about how not as well run the Rockets franchise is,
Yeah.
as a perception, he might just stay where he is. So Nick Nurse, we said it. If you're just joining us now, Jackson and I both say Ime Udoka is our top choice to be the Rockets' next head coach. We both believe that Toronto might swoop in and hire Udoka and keep him from the Rockets. So now we're down to Nick Nurse, Frank Vogel type folks. And development of those two, Nick Nurse is better than Frank Vogel in terms of developing the young core. So, all right. Daishen Nix.
Hang on. I've got a soundbite for this.
You know what? I don't want to talk about Daishen Nix. I just don't understand it. I don't know what's going on. And it's a lot of Daishen Nix.
All right. I'm sorry, Kris.
I mean, that's well put because, I mean, Daishen Nix is a Rafael Stone decision.
Yeah.
So beyond that,
it's because like when you look at it, Stone is very attached to some of the guys that he has found, right? Like his gems, right? So I think KJ to an extent, Jayshawn Tate is another one, right? You know, the like overseas, non-traditional route to make it to the NBA. Like, oh, I found this guy, right? I'm going to make him an NBA player. Kevin Porter Jr. Oh, nobody believed in this kid. I'm going to make him a star. Like, and Daishen Nix, like, okay, nobody believed in it. Like, everybody passed on this guy. He should have been a lottery talent, right? Like some of the terminology and the PR around these guys. And it's like, well, like not really. Like I went into this season, Kris, thinking, okay, Daishen should get half a season to prove himself, to see, okay, is there something there as like flashes of being a good, at least solid backup point guard? Because unfortunately, it was to the point where you weren't going to learn anything new about him at the G League level, right? Like if you threw him down at the G League, he was going to average LeBron James numbers, like 37 and 7, and you don't learn anything new. So he needed the reps at the NBA level as a consistent backup point guard, which he didn't get the previous season. And that made sense. And I was all for it, right? Even though, and Ty Ty's a rookie, it's fine. You've got time to evaluate Ty Ty. But at about the halfway season point, I feel like we saw enough and we didn't see enough good things out of Daishen that the experiment probably should have been ended. And then you probably should have segued over and given your first round draft pick, Ty Washington, some more burn at the NBA level to see what you had. Because now we're in the pickle where they really didn't give Ty much run, if at all. And he did look good in the minimal run that he did get. Better than any point this season, I think, for Daishen Nix, arguably. And now you're going into this next season where very clearly their biggest position of need is the point guard spot. If you draft Scoot Henderson, are you really going to be content going into the season with Scoot Henderson as your de facto starting point guard? So probably getting 30 plus minutes a night. And then Ty Washington as your backup point guard and no veteran guard. And if you do bring in a veteran guard to back up Scoot Henderson under this hypothetical, then Ty Washington now gets squeezed for minutes. So it's like a lose situation where they could have vetted Ty a little bit more, given him some runway to get those mistakes out and kind of decide, okay, do we need to go get a veteran guard, or is he capable of at least being our backup guard as early as next season? Because that's when the calculus shifts on their roster lineup, roster permutations, how they're going to flesh out this roster, their competitiveness level, like all that stuff. It all changes at the start of this next season. So I'm disappointed from that regard.
This question that I'm going to ask addresses a lot of the questions, I think, from the fans. Who do you believe the Rockets will sign as veterans? Because we heard that. Rafael said it at the media session. We all believe it, thought it, known it for years. For a couple of years, Rockets need veterans. Who do you think they should/will sign? And who from this year's roster, like Daishen Nix, Jayshawn Tate, won't be back? Usman Garuba won't be back because of the veterans they do sign via free agency.
Oh, man. It's really tough, Kris, because I don't want to cop out here and say, well, I don't know. It's more so, it's so much of this is dependent on the very first domino that falls, right? And that's where they pick in the draft.
Sure, of course, yeah.
The draft is going to dictate a lot, right? Because if you get Scoot Henderson, then, okay, that's your point guard situation pretty much solved overnight. Like, I mean, you might still need to flesh it out and bring in like a backup point guard, but instead of having to go out there and get maybe, throwing the bag at, say, a James Harden if he leaves Philly, if he's upset, whatever, like that is very much still an option there, where there's smoke, there's fire. And at least from my understanding, there are people on both sides of that would want to make that happen, right? A James Harden reunion could absolutely be in the works if he is, a little bit disillusioned with his situation in Philadelphia, potentially moving forward. So I think that they desperately need, to me, the easiest position to identify that they could upgrade is probably the starting small forward spot. Okay. I think that's the position where if you take Stone's words at face value that they want to add multiple veterans this offseason, and maybe they don't go the route of throwing a $50 million max contract at James Harden, you're going to have about $60 million in cap space to work with. I would really heavily take a look at a guy like Cam Johnson with the Nets, because he's a restricted free agent. You can offer him a contract that the Nets might be really hesitant to match because of all the constraints with the new CBA going into effect starting next year. The tax penalties for luxury tax paying teams, the strict regulations, all that. And then on top of that, it's going to be really curious to see whether the Nets actually decide to tear it down or try to put forward some semblance of like a competitive roster moving forward, because they finished out this year. They made it to the playoffs, but then you get swept, right? And you lose game 4 to a team that doesn't even have their best player in Joel Embiid. Like, how far can this Nets team realistically go, especially because they've got the weight of Ben Simmons' contract dragging them down, and they're locked into that. They're going to have to offload assets just to get rid of the contract, let alone try and bring something of value back. So, but they're in this weird pickle where they don't own their draft capital because, it's here in Houston, right? So I've kind of echoed the sentiment for a while. I think the Rockets are in this very unique position as far as leverage, where they could be a very interesting trade partner for the Nets at any point, because Stone picks up the phone and calls up Brooklyn and says, hey, like, if you guys actually want to tank and like bottom out the way we did, you can have your picks back. Just give me something good in return. Give me, a Cam Johnson sign and trade, or give me a Mikal Bridges. Like, I think there's some legitimate negotiating power there, that those picks have more value than any other set of picks in the NBA to Brooklyn, because it allows them to then dictate their own future, whether they want to bottom out, whether they want to trade them subsequently, whatever. So I definitely would look at Cam Johnson as one of the names is at the very top of my list. Also, Grant Williams is another name that I would very much want the Rockets to take a look at. Some other names from around the league that you could maybe make arguments would be a good fit, kind of answer some questions. Pat Beverly is obviously, Rockets fan favorite, ex-former Houston Rocket. He, was always beloved during his time here in Houston. He's very much a guy who kind of fits that mold as a, solid kind of veteran influence, somebody who can, teach these young guys what it means to be a pros pro at the NBA level. Yeah, he comes with a little bit of the antics and the, the on the court stuff, his pesky defensive nature, all that. But that's part of the love that you get with Patrick Beverley. It's part of the on the court product. Whoever they decide to ultimately bring in, I kind of boil it down to, they pretty much need, if they're going to go the multi-veteran route, they need to bring in a guard, they need to bring in a wing, and they need to bring in a big. So that way they can flesh out the roster across as many positions as possible. And hopefully what we see under whoever the next head coach is next season is it's a bit more of a meritocracy with the lineups and with, who gets minutes, because this past season, we saw a lot of games where Jabari played terrible, or Sengun played terrible, or Kevin played terrible, or Jalen played terrible. And guess what? They still got 30 plus minutes a night because they're young, they're developing. You're going to get the run no matter what. Next year, it probably can't be that way. Like, if Jabari's struggling in a given game, like 0 for 8, struggling on defense, like, plug Tari and see if he's got it going, right? Plug the veteran in if you've got a veteran wing signed, right? There need to be different approaches, different lineups, different ways to cobble together what is hopefully a winning roster next season. And I think that's the easiest way to accomplish that, is to bring in a veteran guard, a veteran wing, and a veteran big man.
All right. I'm going to pin you down here. Asleep Art, thank you for your sticker contribution as well. And folks, if you want to know, click on the little money sticker buttons on the YouTube channel. You can make a donation to the Houston Roundball Review on YouTube. All right. You said it a little bit. If the Rockets get the first or second pick, let's say the Rockets get second pick, get Scoot Henderson, should they still go after James Harden?
Absolutely not. I do not believe that there's a world where you can effectively have those two guys coexist. James Harden and Scoot Henderson, right? James Harden is who he is at this point as an NBA player, right? I think we tried to maybe talk ourselves into it a few years ago about the idea of James Harden maybe playing a bit more off ball to a Chris Paul type and this, that, and the other thing. It's never going to happen. James loves having the ball in his hands. He plays a certain way, and that's who he's going to be to the day that he retires. And that's fine. He is a top 10, top 20, whatever, wherever you want to rank him this season. He's one of the greatest players of all time playing that specific way. It would be a ridiculous thing to expect him to suddenly change his play style to accommodate a rookie in Scoot Henderson just to be able to put the ball in his hands so that he can get the necessary reps to make the mistakes and the territory that comes with being, a future starting caliber star NBA level point guard, right? He needs those bumps in the road. He needs to take his lumps as a rookie, as a sophomore. And the only way for him to do that is to have the ball in his hands. And I don't think there's a world where you not only throw like the bag at James Harden, but then if you did have Scoot Henderson, like what are you going to do? Bring him off the bench? I don't think the Rockets would bring the number 2 overall pick off the bench. I think Scoot probably wouldn't want to come off the bench, given at least, my early assessment of what he's like from like interviews, public, available, interviews, that kind of stuff. He seems very self-assured, very confident, not
Very
cocky,
confident.
not cocky,
very confident, very confident.
But you need a level of that confidence, right? You've got to believe you're the guy. And like the fact that he's like, I should go number 1, right? Over Wemby. It's like, okay, well, read the room a little bit, but I love that kind of confidence in a player, right? You need that kind of confidence to be able to succeed at this level. So that said, though, Scoot needs the runway to sink or swim. And I don't necessarily think a lineup of like Scoot Henderson, Jalen Green, and like what James Harden at the 3 works, because again, James isn't going to play off ball to those two guys. Now, if you don't get Scoot Henderson, that's where you're maybe opening up the can of worms a little bit more. And you're thinking, okay, well, James addresses a lot of those issues at the point guard spot. But the problem, and this is like the catch-22, the double-edged sword with James, is you're very much signing up for a very specific brand of basketball if you bring him back. It's going to be the heliocentric, I'm going to dominate the ball, I'm going to pound the air out of it for 15 to 20 seconds at a time, and I'm going to dissect the opposing defense down to the very last second, and I'm going to generate us a good shot, but it's not going to be some version of like motion, free-flowing, beautiful offense. And I think that actually goes counter to the offensive philosophies and identities for guys like Atkinson, Udoka, and Nick Nurse specifically. I think it could work well with Vogel because Vogel doesn't really have that much of an offensive system. So he would probably be very content to just give James the ball and say, okay, go run the show. And that would work out well. And then defensively gets the rest of the roster to buy in. Maybe you're cooking with something like that. But Chris, I don't know where your head is at with the Harden return possibly, but like I started out, I was like vehemently against the idea. Then I warmed up to the idea and thought, okay, he does address a lot of the issues for this team. And then I've kind of waned on it again, where I'm just like, I don't know if it's scary, the idea of committing that amount of money to a guy who's going to be 34 years old at the start of next season. He's not going to settle for less than the max is the problem. Like, unless Philly tries to get really cute with it. And if Philly tries to offer him less than the max, then maybe the Rockets can get into like, what's the opposite of a bidding war, Chris? Because that's like that's kind of what I think like could, right? Like if Philly offers him like 30 mil a year and then Houston's like, okay, we'll give you 35. Like that's kind of a steal. Like, and then maybe he's screwed and he has to pick between these two terrible options. He's like, I guess I'll take the 35. Like maybe that's what happens, but I don't think that's likely whatsoever. So I don't know. That's where I'm at on James Harden. I've kind of cooled on the idea of bringing him back, and I'd much rather the idea of a Scoot Henderson. Obviously, that's a lot of luck in that one, but even maybe past that, just the idea of bringing in a veteran guard or going out and procuring a veteran guard. Like if you could trade for like a Tyus Jones type possibly to come in here and kind of run the show that way, that would be a substantial upgrade.
The money, I think, is a concern. James is still talented. Clearly, he's not as talented as he was here because he's older. I'm not sure. I don't believe it'd be a good fit beyond 2 years for the Rockets. So it's definitely a short-term hire, signing, a ticket signing, all those things. So I know for James, does not mean I don't believe it still might happen though, but I'm not in favor of it. Jacob, What do you think is his future with the Rockets? Jacob and Oos.
Those are two guys that could very easily be on the way out, right? Like there's going to be significant roster churn this offseason. They basically, right, the last handful of years, they've committed to just having minimal to no veterans on the roster, no shots taken at our guy, Eric Gordon.
Oh my.
But they just, they're going to need space, right? They're going to need space to sign these, these supposed veterans that they want to bring in. And guys like Christopher and Garuba are kind of on the precipice, right? They may or may not make it to next year's team. I still am incredibly high on what Josh Christopher can be as an NBA player, but I think so much of what he can be has to start on the defensive end.
Right.
And to this point, 2 years in, I don't know if we've seen enough progress from him defensively to think like, yeah, he can be like that, maybe like defensive, like perimeter ace, point of attack defender. But that also wasn't Steven Silas's forte, right? That wasn't his ballpark. And so maybe you bring in a more defensive minded coach and suddenly he's able to transform Josh Christopher into, I'm not saying like, Davion Mitchell or something, but just a more like a very solid plus level defender on the perimeter. Like that's where a lot of players can make, earn their bread, earn their keep, is if you actually try hard defensively. And that's where Garuba does have a lot of success. And I think that Garuba could still be a really effective, like kind of Swiss Army knife, third string big man, or even a backup big man in the right situation. But it just might push might come to shove where it's just, if they need those roster spots, I think those guys are kind of on the bubble, I guess, about whether or not they return next year.
This question from WK, I think, also depends on where the Rockets land in the lottery. But are vets added in the offseason coming off the bench or starting?
I think I kind of like mentioned this earlier when we first tackled the veteran question, or the previous version of the veteran question. But to me, the easiest spot to identify in the Rockets starting lineup, or spots, I'll say, that they could easily add a veteran presence, is the small forward spot, and then also the starting point guard spot. Now, that point guard spot, it's kind of nebulous because if you get Scoot Henderson, then clearly you're not starting a veteran there. You're starting Scoot Henderson. So that becomes a little bit harder because let's face it, Jalen is locked into his spot, right? Jalen's not going anywhere. Jalen's your starting two guard. Jabari is going to be locked into his spot at the 4. I think that's pretty safe to assume. I think that if Sengun is on the roster, he'll probably be the starting 5. Like, I feel like that's a pretty safe assumption. Kevin Porter Jr. is the one really big question mark, but because it's very clear that the experiment just hasn't quite worked out to this point, they need a point guard. So maybe you move Kevin to the bench. Maybe he gets traded. Maybe they even move him to the 3 spot. But even then, I think that doesn't necessarily answer the issue of like lack of veteran presence in the starting lineup. So to me, the easiest solution is your guaranteed starters are Jalen, Jabari, and Sengun. And then you add that veteran presence via the point guard spot and the small forward spot. And again, there are a lot of really interesting options this offseason to go after as far as veteran small forward additions. A couple of the names I mentioned, Cam Johnson, Grant Williams, right out of the gate. Those 2 guys would be really, really solid. You also still have the option of potentially leaving KJ Martin in the starting lineup, right? He's done a lot with the minutes that he's been given, but he also doesn't necessarily provide you that veteran impact presence that you would necessarily want out of that role. So again, to me, it's just that 3 spot is the cleanest and easiest way to add a veteran presence in that lineup. And you can even maybe point to the reason Eric Gordon started for so many games is because he was the one veteran piece that the Rockets had, but because they couldn't exactly go about benching one of Jalen or KPJ, Eric started, and by default, he started at the 3 spot. So if Eric Gordon was, 4 or 5 inches taller, he'd be the perfect starting small forward for that group of guys, right? A 3-and-D, catch and shoot, doesn't necessarily need the ball in his hands to be effective on the floor. Like, that would have been incredible, but he was 6'3", and the Rockets basically ran a 3-guard set for most of the season and struggled a lot at times because of it.
Brook Lopez, should the Rockets go after him?
I'd like Brook Lopez. I think that it's no matter who the Rockets go after, right? They're going to pay a premium on any of the veterans that they add, right? They're going to pay the bad team tax, if you will. And
yep.
I don't know how many times I've said this before. It takes the right veteran to want to be in the situation that the Rockets are going to be in next season, right? Not every veteran is up to the task of, yeah, I'm willingly going to go sign with that really bad team, knowing it's going to be a lot of work to actually teach these guys how to, get better, how to be a competent organization, right? Some guys are all about it. And then also some guys are all about a payday, right? So it very could well be that Milwaukee doesn't want to pony up to hold on to Brook Lopez. And if Milwaukee offers him something in the ballpark of like, $15 million a year average annual value, and the Rockets swoop in and they want to offer him 20 or 25, saying no to an extra $5 or $10 million a year is really difficult, especially if you're at the stage of career that Brook Lopez is at. I mean, shoot, we saw Trevor Ariza right after the Rockets, had a chance to had the Warriors on the ropes, right? We saw Trevor Ariza say, you know what, Houston, it's been fun. I did my 4 years. Phoenix wants to pay me $30 million over 2 years, and that's way better than what you guys are offering. So sayonara. And that hurts, right? That really stung because the Rockets weren't really able to cobble together a replacement for Ariza, right? They went through James Ennis, they went through Carmelo Anthony, they eventually settled on Daniel House that season. But it was a very weird, like, that position was in flux, and Milwaukee could very well be in that exact same boat this offseason without like a reliable replacement for Brook Lopez. If a team like Houston comes in and says, hey, Brook, $25 million a year, come play for us. And then that gives you a really legitimate option, either as a backup to Alp or potentially as a starter. Like maybe you start Brook Lopez in the middle because you want like that level of defense right out of the gate. Who knows?
Well, let me ask you, if they were to give Brook, a 2-year, $45 million deal, would you start him and say, Alp, what would you do with Alp? Let's just put it like that. Just move him to the floor, bring him off the bench. What?
I desperately, KG, I want to see what Alp can do defensively with a coach that actually lets him try different things defensively. I think that in the right scheme, with the right motivation around him, with the other 4 guys on the court, I don't necessarily think Alp is anywhere near the defensive liability that he's been made out to be. The entire Rockets defense was so porous this last season, right? They had their perimeter defense was Swiss cheese. Alp at times in the pick and roll was bad, but it was bad across the board. But I think on an individual basis, I think Alp is not necessarily, it's not like he's secretly a plus defender, but I think you can get away with a lot more than Rockets fans maybe think they can right now with Alp. And I think the right coach will be able to unlock that. So out the gate in a vacuum, I would not say no. Even if you sign Brook Lopez tomorrow, I wouldn't say, yeah, he's the starter over Alp. I would say, let's see what it looks like. Give me a half season of Nurse or Udoka or even Frank Vogel with Alp at the 5 spot and seeing the different wrinkles and schemes and things that they try to do with him defensively to minimize his weakness on that end. Because unfortunately with Steven, and Steven said as much, we have him on record saying this, is he wasn't comfortable doing anything other than playing Alp and drop. And I think that was ultimately a disservice to Alp because you owe it to your players, especially in a lost season, man. Just try stuff. Just right. and yes. And here's the right. We don't know. Maybe they were trying these things in practice and it looked even worse in practice. And Steven was like, hands up in the air, like, okay, there's really nothing I can do with this kid. He's just awful. Maybe that's the case, but I can only go off of what I see, the film that I have access to, the 48 minutes that we are privy to across 82 games in the actual season. And I can count, Kris, on like one hand, the number of times that the Rockets did something other than use Alp and drop coverage, like throughout the entire season. Like they never ran zone with him. They never hedged. They never showed it. Like they never really played like at the level of the screens. Like there's so many different ways that you can get creative with Alp to maybe put the onus on some of the other guys, like on the back line of the defense, like maybe some of the more capable defenders like a Jabari or a KJ, guys who are better equipped to deal with stopping guys on that side of the floor. And we just never saw any of it. So give me a half season of one of those other more, defensively inclined coaches to see what it actually looks like before we just subscribe to the idea of, yeah, Alp needs a replacement because he's bad at defense.
Put this question. I think we've kind of answered it a little bit, but again, from H-Town's Finest, salute to you for your support. Bringing back James, to me, it would be at the expense of the development of the younger guys. And truly, if James is back, Jalen is not the franchise player. Do you agree with that?
I agree with the
first part.
I agree with the latter. Like Jalen would still be considered the franchise player. Like James Harden he would not be the franchise player if he comes back. James would have to understand it's he's not the old James Harden. It's not his team anymore. He's here to help usher in the new age of these young players. The first part I would actually push back on. I guess this is going to be our first disagreement now, Kris, is
okay.
It's a weird, like, I think James very clearly elevates the floor of the team
Yes.
and makes life a lot easier for these young guys, but he also simultaneously caps the ceiling because, like, let's just look at this last season, for example. When Kevin Porter Jr. went down and Jalen Green was forced to become the primary playmaker for about 20 games during the season, I think Jalen got a lot more comfortable and better as a playmaker because he had to, right? There was no other option. If you put James in there, it's like adding training wheels for these rookies or for these young guys, right? Putting James in there is a guy who is going to spoon feed you some of the easiest shots you will ever make in your career. And because of that, by association, by not necessarily being forced into those positions of having to make stuff happen, then I think it kind of puts a damper on what you could maybe see Jalen become, right? If Jabari is basically just shooting spot up wide open jumpers all game, like that's not a bad thing for Jabari. His numbers will probably look great and he's going to get some really easy attempts. But it takes away from maybe some of those moments where he has to create something in the half court because there's not an easy shot or the shot clock's running down. Like it basically becomes James Harden is their safety net. And that's what it would become is James becomes the safety net and he's a really good safety net. Like he's going to be able to carry that team. He's probably maybe not like a walking 50-win team by himself anymore, but he's at least like, if you added James to this roster and made 0 other changes, this roster's winning 35 games next year, bare minimum, like guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even think that's like a crazy thing to say. So, and then you add in the idea that, these kids are all getting, a year older, better, working in the off season. You add another top pick, maybe some other free agency signings. You've maybe got a 40, 45 win team possibly as early as next season, maybe. So it's a catch-22 situation where James absolutely helps the rookies, but he also, I think, decreases their overall ceiling because, again, you subscribe to a very specific play style with him, with the ball in his hands. If you like watching Jalen Green run pick and roll with Al P, get rid of that because that's not happening anymore, right? Jalen Green's going to be spotting up on the side and getting ready to catch and shoot when James drives the ball in. That's what the offense becomes with James.
And James, if James comes here, he would say all the right things initially. Hey, I'm here to help the young guys. I know this is Jalen Green's team. This is Jalen's team. This is Jabari's team. This is the young guys' team. On the court, that would probably work for a month.
Yeah.
And then James being the high caliber player he is, all right, guys, I'm taking over. We got to start winning games. We got to start being better, executing in the offense, all those things. So that would be the issue. It'd be a quick fix, but it would not be the long-term solution.
Yeah. It's a Band-Aid fix is what it is.
Yeah.
It's a very temporary Band-Aid fix that masks a lot of the issues that the team has dealt with. And I do think it could be a decent way to bridge the gap, but I don't necessarily think it's the right way to bridge the gap between where the team currently is and where they want to be.
So as fans can tell who are tuning in on this edition of Let's Talk Houston Rockets, Jackson and I could talk Rocket basketball forever for hours upon hours. We're going to go a few more minutes if you got time, my man.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm in no rush. I'm here as long as you want me.
Because I'm curious about your thoughts on Jalen Brown, because a lot of Rocket fans have him on their wish list. So what would it take for Boston to sign and trade, agree to let Jalen Brown go and become a Rocket?
Man, I mean, it's such a weird situation because I think when you talk about all the different variables that you have to consider when the Rockets are looking at their next head coach, like that's one of them is think about Ime Udoka's prior relationship with Jalen Brown and the fact that in the aftermath of Ime's situation with Boston, I mean, Jalen Brown was one of the players that was most vocal about the loss of Udoka and what he meant to them in that locker room. The fact that he was their leader, it really seemed to take its toll, arguably the most on Jalen Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And right, Ime was the one who kind of guided that frustration and kind of healed that Celtics team and got them to a point where, there was speculation. Oh, can Jason Tatum and Jalen Brown truly coexist? Are they going to have to choose one of them, trade one of them?
Mm-hmm.
And Ime got them through that and got them to the finals. Like that was a tumultuous season for the Celtics. So to go through that with that type of coach and then lose him, recently Bill Simmons was on his podcast and he was talking with Brian Windhorst and they were speculating on Jalen Brown's future. And when Brian Windhorst was kind of going through, speculating, oh, well, he might want to go to city X and play with player Y. And Bill Simmons kind of dejectedly chimed in and said the word Houston, like very just Houston, like very under his breath, and almost seemed so like resigned, didn't want to say it, right? Didn't want to utter in his mind such a dirty word because he hates the city of Houston for whatever reason. Yes. And I very much like if Bill Simmons, right, who is very like, you can doubt his connections with other organizations. You can, take it with a grain of salt, his opinions, his analysis about, other large scale NBA stuff. But when it comes to the Celtics, Bill Simmons is very plugged in. There's no denying that. So if Bill Simmons is worried that Houston might be a player for Jalen Brown, that is something you take with maybe a slightly bigger, smaller grain of salt, whatever direction the grain of salt has to go, because there might be some legitimacy to that. So I'm torn because, Chris, I wouldn't want to see the Rockets give up like a ton of value for Jalen Brown like this offseason. But if the Celtics are in a position where they feel like he might just walk and they lose him for nothing next offseason, then I think you definitely have to pick up the phone and at least explore those conversations and see what it looks like. Because you could very easily, right, if there's an under the table, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, handshake agreement that Jalen Brown would re-sign with the Rockets at the end of his current contract next offseason, which if they traded for him, they would have his full bird rights. They could sign him to whatever his max top dollar value is without any issues about where they stand as far as the cap is concerned, all that stuff. That would be great because then you could still freely use that $60 million in cap space this offseason, bring in your veteran guys, whatever, and then you could still trade for Jalen Brown, and you could very easily cobble together that salary by combining, let's say, I think Jalen Brown's making like $30 million this offseason, or $30 million this year. So you could combine Kevin Porter Jr., who will be up to about $16 million once we hit July 1st. So KPJ, Jayshawn Tate, and say KJ Martin. And you could put those three guys together, and maybe you even include like a pick or two as a consolation. Like, hey, we know that Jalen threatened to walk for nothing. It sucks you're losing him. Here's like a small stimulus package of pieces. And then Jalen Brown becomes your starting small forward. And then suddenly, like, he answers a lot of those questions, right? Where he is your veteran presence. He is your best player on the roster immediately, overnight. He's not the franchise guy, mind you. Like, Jalen's still franchise tag, whatever. And Jalen Brown would probably have to understand that coming in, is like he's being brought in to be the guiding light for this team, but he's not, like, the buck doesn't start and stop with him just because he got traded here and he's no longer playing Robin to Jason Tatum's Batman. And if you were able to pull off a trade like that with the Celtics, and you also walk away somehow with like the number 2 overall pick, and you've got Scoot Henderson, Chris, that's one hell of a starting lineup as early as next season, right? Scoot, Jalen, Jabari, and Sengun. Whew. I would be ecstatic if they were able to pull something off like that. I don't know if it's super likely. If the Celtics do entertain the idea of trading Jalen Brown, I feel like it would happen more towards the midseason mark rather than this offseason. But it's definitely something that Rockets fans need to have on their radar, because Jalen Brown to Houston could be a very legitimately real possibility.
If the Rockets land 5th or worse May 16th in the lottery, then what?
Why we got to talk about these bad vibes, Chris? Instead, we should, what we should do? We should just
pray for Victor.
Pray for Victor, man. But originally, I was basically, if it's not 1 or 2, like it's not pick 1 or 2, it's bust, trade it. Like 3 or down, I was like, just trade it. I've warmed up to the idea of Brandon Miller. He'd be a nice, I guess it feels harsh calling him a consolation prize to Victor and Scoot, but that's kind of how it would be. 4 and lower, or in this case, 5 or lower, 5 or 6. I think you've got to really decide what the direction is going to be for the team next year. Are you going to be content with essentially like phase 1.5 of the rebuild, where you want to bring in an Amin Thompson or a Cam Whitmore, Jarris Walker, a young guy who's going to need some time to develop? Or do you flip the pick and trade it for a more ready-made, ready-to-go, established veteran NBA player? And you could do that, and like that player could just be like one of your free agency signings, if you will, because you could just trade with a team and have that player be traded directly into the mountain of cap space that the Rockets have. So you wouldn't even necessarily have to send anything out of value. You could just trade the pick out or the rights to the player, or however the specifics, the logistics actually work. But that's something to consider. I think I'm not super excited by many of the prospects outside of the top 3.
Neither am I.
Yeah, mostly because like with the Thompson twins, right? The overtime elite, the level of competition that they're playing with over there, like you have no idea what they're actually going to look like at the NBA level, right? It's kind of already a crapshoot when you're trying to evaluate G League guys compared to NBA players and how that's going to translate. It's even worse when you look at the overtime elite and you're like, this is kind of a joke, the competition that they're playing against. Jarris Walker, good, but I think he's going to take some time to work himself in at the NBA level. I do think there's like, I see kind of like maybe like a Bam Adebayo-esque role with him potentially further down the line, but like, how does that fit in with Houston's long-term projections, right? Does that work in a front court alongside Sengun? Are there question marks then about who's the long-term starting big man? And then you just go even further down the line, right? Cam Whitmore, Grady Dick, Anthony Black. Like I'm not super excited about any of those prospects, unfortunately. And the Rockets are at a point where they just don't have any more runway to just be bad for another half season or a year while XYZ prospect gets up to speed. They've already got young guys that are still going to be going through some of their lumps this next year, right? Just because Tari and Jabari and Ty are in their sophomore years doesn't mean they're still incredibly young players trying to figure it out. And so we're Jalen. So is LP. Like they're all still learning. It just becomes really hard if you add yet another mouth to feed on top of that. So for me, if it's 4 or lower, heavily entertain the idea of trading the pick for a veteran piece.
Let's get into this as folks who cover the Rockets, local people who cover the Rockets. You more this past season spent time with the Rockets than me because I spent more time with the Cougs. But in your time with the Rockets, did you see any of this national perception of bad chemistry issues, locker room issues that became the national narrative?
Easy answer, Kris. No. But I think, and you can probably attest to this, right? Just because we are there as credentialed media and we're able to go into the locker room and all that, it's not like we have free run of the place where we're able to like sit in a broom closet and spy on the players and try and, get a gotcha moment. Like, oh, Kevin's, yelling at Jalen in the locker room and I'm hiding in the locker and I saw it with my own 2 eyes. It's not how it works, right? It's very, what's the word that I want to, it's not like, I don't want to say manicured. Like it's just very, the environments are very like sterile. It's almost like walking into a dentist's office, right? Where it's, you walk into the locker room, the players get a heads up. Like they get told before we enter the locker room and they get like a 5-minute grace period. Like, hey, media's coming in here. Whatever you're doing, stop it. Be on your best behavior. Like, and then we leave and then they go back to doing whatever they want.
It's not like it used to be. Yeah. Trust me on that. It's very different.
And again, I never experienced the pre-COVID locker rooms. And I know that it was a lot more laissez-faire. You'd maybe get a lot more candid conversations and interactions between players. So, it's definitely not how it used to be. But because of that, no, like you're not going to just like, I'm not going to be walking past a random hallway and see like Kevin yelling at assistant coach. Like that's just not going to happen. So much of it is hidden and it's still behind closed doors. Now, with that said, from some of the people that I have spoken to within the organization and around the team, there have been a couple of occurrences of players maybe not necessarily putting their best foot forward or some frustration, some, kind of off the court issues that have transpired this last season that do root back to Kevin Porter Jr., unfortunately, is just like, that's just the de facto case. And so it's frustrating because Kevin has put his best foot forward. I think he's doing everything he can to kind of play with his head on straight and be the best version of himself on the basketball court, all that stuff. But there's just a lot of baggage that and it's not only Kevin, it's a very young, immature team that desperately needs a leader. And as good of a human being and as nice of a person as Steven Silas was, he was not a good leader for this young group of men. And because of that, I think at times he experienced pushback or his voice was falling on deaf ears and guys were kind of just doing whatever they wanted. And that was very much of a legitimate concern about what this team dealt with this year, because you can have a roster that all the guys love each other, right? Like there's different versions of like bad locker room chemistry, right? This wasn't like the James Harden, Dwight Howard era of like there's locker room strife and these guys aren't talking to each other and they're mad. No, like everybody on the team loves each other. But I think they kind of at points would tune out the coaching staff because there was a disconnect there between what the coaches were preaching and what Steven was trying to accomplish and what the players wanted to do, essentially.
I'm going to put this up for Tim Dunn. Tim, we've touched on it throughout. We believe.
Have we talked about Udoka? I don't think we have, Kris.
Udoka is our choice for the job. We also believe that Toronto might swoop in and take him very quickly before the Rockets make their decision. So that's why we've had Nick Nurse, Frank Vogel more in the discussion than Udoka. So yes, if we were GM, Udoka would be the Rockets head coach. But we are not, as you all know, who are participating in this great edition of the Let's Talk Houston Rockets with me and Jackson Gatlin. A few more minutes here. This is a lot of fun. Let me see if I've missed anything. Yep, Sam Cassell will interview. And you touched on it, but for those who did not see it at the beginning, your thoughts on Sam as our head coach for the Rockets?
With Sam, right, it's such a different dynamic. For those that weren't here earlier when we first talked about Sam, it's such a different dynamic than a few years ago when they hired rookie head coach Steven Silas, right? And it would be a different dynamic because, again, Sam carries a significant amount of pedigree, both as a coach, as somebody who's been on a number of different sidelines at the NBA level, and then just as a player, right? There's something that I think former players who weren't necessarily, right, like star players, right? Guys who really had to grind for what they became, what they accomplished. And I have a huge amount of respect for guys who have done that, right? Like guys like a Willie Green or an Ime Udoka, or like, I think Jason Kidd is probably the highest profile former player. I mean, some toss up between Jason Kidd and Chauncey Billups, right? Highest profile former player turned coach. And even that, they've had varying degrees of success in their own right, but I feel like there's something different about that role player mentality, right? Somebody who had to really, like, they had to fight for their minutes. They never were guaranteed a spot in the rotation. Those guys know what it takes to win, and they know what it takes to find success at the NBA level. So when they become head coaches or assistant coaches or whatever, they know how to get the most out of their guys. And to me, that's easily a huge point in Ime Udoka's favor when you're looking at the next potential head coach. I just think he's going to have a way to relate to some of these players on this roster that Vogel, Nurse, Atkinson, like, never would.
I think we've answered this a few times, but your opinion on Uzi?
Also, just to that on that previous point, right? Sorry, same point for Sam Cassell that I also highlighted for Ime, right? I forgot to tack that on at the end. And Sam gets the same bonus point for former player, understands all those things that I highlighted. He gets that point as well. For Uzi, it's so tough, man. Like, I was with the moment when his three ball started falling, Kris, I was thinking, man, like, it's happening, like it's all coming together for him. And then he went like 1 of 18 to close out the year or something from 3. So it showed up and then it was gone as quickly as it showed up. It's tough because he has all the makings of like a high end, like 7th or 8th man off the bench role player at the NBA level. And he's a really smart player. Like, that's one thing that was in such short supply on this Rockets team this last year was high IQ players.
Yes.
And I think that you can identify like Sengun is a high IQ guy. Garuba is high IQ. Ty was high IQ in the brief minutes that he had on the floor. And then like Eric was high IQ, but Eric got traded. So like that's one down. So I think it's really tough at that point when you're playing so many guys who just don't have that like innate feel for the game, or they're not quite there yet as far as their understanding of how certain things are supposed to happen on the court. Whereas when you watch one of those guys, like when you watch Sengun make his decisions on the floor, right? Yeah, he makes some dumb decisions sometimes, but he also makes really high level reads and he like anticipates both on offense and defense. Garuba does the exact same thing. Like when Garuba gets the ball in the short roll and he's barreling towards the rim, he'll make a very quick read and boom, pass out to the open shooter. And you're like, where is this? Why aren't we doing this more consistently? Ty, when he's running the pick and roll, he just makes good, consistent, high IQ decisions on the floor. Whereas the other guys throughout the roster, Jalen, KJ, KPJ at times, whatever, like, they struggle at times to make just the simple right read, the simple right decision. And that's just a byproduct of being a young team. It can get better over time. Those guys just have a bit more of a better baseline for their basketball IQ.
Two scenarios for you. You touched on it. One, Rockets bring back James Harden.
Oh, my.
How many wins for the Rockets next year with James Harden on the team?
With just James Harden added to this exact team, I think it's probably, what's the question, wins added or just wins total? Or
wins total.
I'd say probably 35. I'd say in between 35 to 40 with just James added to this exact team.
If the Rockets get Wemby and bring in two solid vets, not Jalen Brown, elite, but solid vets, how many wins for the team?
25 to 30.
If the Rockets get Scoot and two solid vets, 2 or 3 solid vets, how many wins for the team?
25 to 30 again.
All right, fans, what do you think about that? So in those 3 right there, that is still not a playoff team.
No. The 35 one is like on the cusp, isn't it? Play in.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, there we go. With James, do you see the Rockets in that 7 to 10 play-in window? Not 1 to 6, but 7 to 10.
I think they very easily could be, right? Like it's just, again, James historically, right? He just has his floor is ridiculous as a player. He will drag you almost single. And I think the other addition that we do have to take into account with this, right, is they're adding a new head coach, right? So just the addition of upgrading the head coaching position and then adding a James Harden, right? That's, again, a 35-win team, I think, right out of the gate, just with all the talent. Because, Chris, I talked myself into the beginning of this last season. I was looking at all the talent on the Rockets roster, and I was like, I think I was being pretty objective about it. I was like, I think this team is pound for pound more talented than the OKC roster. Shea is still very clearly the best player on either of the two teams, and then he became a top 10 player this year in the NBA. He took a huge leap this year. I don't even know if OKC fans saw that leap coming, but I think before the season, if you were being objective looking at both rosters, you were like, yeah, the Rockets roster has a lot more talent. And yet they did significantly less with that talent. And the argument that consistently gets thrown up when you try to compare, OKC to Houston is, they have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. The Thunder were still a competent, good basketball team without SGA on the floor is the problem. And they played about, I think it was just under 1,600 minutes this season without SGA. And their net rating in those minutes without SGA was like minus 2.2 or something. And their minutes with SGA were in the plus. They were positive in the minutes that he was on the floor. Meanwhile, the Rockets' 2 main starting lineups this season, right? So the one with Eric Gordon at the 3 spot, and then the one with KJ at the 3 spot, both of them horrendously net negative, right? That's their starting lineup was awful. The OKC bench unit was better than the Rockets starters consistently over the course of this last season. That has nothing to do with SGA being there. So
what was Lionel Holland's role on the team, on the staff? To tell good stories?
I'm really not sure. Like part of me doesn't know how much of this is Lionel's fault versus Stevens, because, right, we had Steven there at the end of the season basically tell us that Mahmoud was pleading for him to install a certain play, and he'd been begging for him to do it for a month. And then it took Rig Higgins chiming in and saying, put it in, put the play in, do it, please, for the love of God. And so I think one of the things that has to be considered here when you look at head coaches and how they operate, right, is a head coach is effectively, you're the manager, right? You're the guy running the show. And a good manager, a good leader has to be able to seek and also subsequently apply input from his staff, from his employees. And I don't know if necessarily Steven was maybe the best at doing that, right? So Lionel may have been giving Steven defensive suggestions and ideas on what to do on that side of the ball, but Steven may have just tuned him out and decided he was going to do his own thing, and he was only comfortable playing Sengun a certain way, or they were only comfortable playing certain coverages. So Lionel Hollins is a guy who had a lot of, defensive success over his career, right? The grit and grind Grizzlies. He was on the coaching staff of the Lakers in 2020 with Frank Vogel when they won the ring. And he was largely, I think, given credit for some of the defensive schemes that they utilized in the bubble. Like they did this against the Rockets, they did like a scram switching scheme, which really messed up the Rockets spacing consistently in that playoff series. And I believe Frank Vogel credited Lionel Hollins with that scheme that ultimately helped them win that series. So it's not that Lionel Hollins didn't do anything. It's just maybe he just wasn't being utilized properly on this coaching staff. So
that's fair, because I didn't even acknowledge that as a possibility, because I thought he'd have more influence on the defense. I expected Rocks to be way better defensively with him on the staff, and they weren't. But it could have been because Steven did not, allow the input, which would be another strike against him. That's why he's gone. Okay. We touched on this once a little bit. Would we like to retain Luke on the staff? I say no, clean house. You say it kind of depends. But I really want to ask you this. In a scenario of Rockets getting Wemby, how many wins with Udoka as head coach and Wemby, Nurse as head coach and Wemby, Vogel as head coach and Wemby?
Are we also adding like the whole like adding 2 to 3
solid vets?
veterans?
Everything is the same.
Everything's the
Wemby,
same.
and then different head coach.
Different head coach right out of the gate. I would say, I think Nurse and Udoka probably more so on the top end of that, like 25 to 30. And I'd say Vogel probably on the lower end of that 25 to 30. So like if I had to pick a solid number, I'm just going to say Vogel 26, 27 wins, whatever. And then I'd say Udoka or Nurse somewhere 29 to 30. I just like conceptually what Udoka and Nurse bring to the table offensively by themselves quite a bit more than Vogel. And while I do think all three of them would achieve a baseline level of at least like respectable defense pretty quickly right out of the gate, especially if you give them Wemby to work with, I'm not super jazzed about the idea of what Frank Vogel would be rolling out there offensively. And it might even be, prepare yourself for this, Rockets fans, it might even be worse than what Steven Silas rolled out offensively, because like at least Silas had like this vision for a read and react, free flowing offense. And at times, like when things were firing all cylinders, it could look really good. Or when Jalen had an on night or Alpi had a big night, like it would look sort of solid. With Vogel, I don't even know if you're going to be getting that is the problem. And that's my biggest concern. Whereas Udoka and Nurse pride themselves on the idea of ball movement, sharing the basketball, motion, those kinds of baseline principles on offense that I think could translate to this young group.
All right. I think we touched on as much as possible with a lot of the comments and questions from Rocket fans, KDC, Justin, H-Towns, No Salt, Solo, D-Lo, H-Towns. Again, thank you for your support. Thank you for your question. James Tryon, thank you. I made it happen. I got Jackson on the show. We made it happen. We'll try to do it again. Let's aim for around the lottery.
Absolutely.
So
sometime post lottery, when it becomes less questions about what if the pick does this, and then suddenly, oh, the pick is this. So what ultimately happens? And we got to get you back over on LOR at some point too, Kris.
So sounds good. And again, Jackson and I, how many years now? What has it been? 7?
We met in 2018 was when I started covering Cougars. So 2018, so a little under 6 years, I think.
Okay.
A little under 5, or right around 5 or 6 years, somewhere around there.
But yeah, so thank you very much, my man. I'm very happy for your success. I'm proud of you. It just does this old man heart good to see you shining, Kelly Eco shining, Cody Davis, everybody, doing their part, covering the Rockets, and their coverage of the Rockets and everything like that going forward, because it's in good hands. We got folks here who know basketball in town, and a lot of us are doing our thing and getting national recognition as well. So just, again, I said it in a YouTube short, trust us, the local folks, when it comes to covering the Rockets. All right, so just trust me on that, and we're going to continue doing that, bringing you Rocket content throughout social media. How can folks find you in case they don't know? How can folks find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter for however long that lasts before Elon pile drives it into the ground, at JT Gatlin. And then if you want to hear more musings on the Rockets, talk about the Rockets a lot over at Locked On Rockets. I do Locked On NBA every Monday for the Locked On Network, whatever the three biggest stories are from around the NBA landscape over the course of the weekend. And then I also host a lot of live Rockets discussions and content over at Rockets Watch with Dave Hardesty and Roosh Williams as well. So track me down on any of those locations.
And no salty guys. I'm going to try to get Big Sarge. I need to get him on the show before Texans football really goes into true football mode for Sarge and that. And he still does Astros as well. So that's in the works as well. And also, I'm going to do my Folks Talking Sports show on Sunday with Andy Yanez, who Jackson knows, and Willie Gibson from Ohio. So I'm doing that. I got another interview in the works with someone from the Big 12 office. I did one yesterday with the VP of men's basketball, John Williams. I have another interview lined up for another person in the Big 12 office. Who's in the Big 12? I got a lot of plans. I know folks in the Big 12 that y'all going to find out. So trust me on that. But as always, everybody for watching us tonight on this edition of Let's Talk Houston Rockets. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule, your night, your lives to spend time with me and Jackson discussing the Houston Rockets. We'll do it again soon. Well, I'll do it again soon on Let's Talk Houston Rockets, probably next Saturday. Me and Jackson will work it out about me being on LOR, and then he'll come back on here as well in the future. We're going to do that. So a lot of good content in store for everyone. So Jackson, thank you, my man, for taking time to talk to me and the fan this evening. And everybody out there, you guys take care. Until next time, peace.